everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. Cool stuff to talk about today. You're going to like this. So we've been talking about the abolitionist movement a little bit yesterday. The movement to get rid of slavery altogether. So abolition would be to get rid of slavery as the law, to say you can't have slavery, so the law exists. All the slaves would be freed. There's also this concept of emancipation, which is to free all the slaves. So you could technically free all the slaves with emancipation, yet the laws that allow slavery to exist could still exist under just the emancipation idea. They're very similar when we use emancipation and abolition. A lot of times back and forth, they're interchangeably, but there is a difference. So abolition gets rid of the law of slavery and frees everybody. Emancipation would just free everybody, but it would allow the laws to exist so that they could just bring in other people to be slaves. All right, so today we are going to talk about some really cool stories in the abolitionist movement. Specifically today, we're going to talk about some slaves who adamantly are going to fight against the institution of slavery that are extremely famous. One of which you probably have heard of, her name being Harriet Tubman. All right, so we're going to get to her here shortly, but let me go ahead and make myself smaller because the coolest story, boop, 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 boop. All right. I guess you can't really say coolest. That's completely subjective. There is a story that we're going to start with today that is crazy. All right. It's the story of Frederick Douglas. All right. So Frederick Douglas is going to be a huge pivotal role in the entire abolitionist movement and is going to fundamentally change the course of America because, very similar to Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, Frederick Douglas is going to do something similar, but it's going to have a very deep and profound effect on American society moving forward. All right. So who is Frederick Douglass? Well, the cool thing about Frederick Douglass is his story is just amazing. So we're going to start with Frederick Douglass as a kid. Frederick Douglass is a slave, and he is born a slave. So let me get here. I want to do this right here. All right. So I'm going to get myself out of here. All right. So I'm not going to be bothering y'all. So here's where the story is going to start at. It's going to start with Frederick Douglass as a young child. All right. So Frederick Douglass doesn't even know exactly when he's going to be born. The guess is somewhere around 1818 is probably when he's going to be born. So he is going to spend most of his life in Maryland. Today in North Carolina, we assume Maryland as a northern state. Maryland, by de facto, is a southern state. Maryland was a slave-owning southern state. Anything north of Maryland would be considered a slave state. So he's in Maryland. So here's the situation with Frederick Douglass. So Frederick Douglass is born. He's basically taken from his mother. He only sees her a handful of times. Horrific story, kind of like what we talked about with what Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote about in Uncle Tom's Cabin, being torn apart from his mother. He is sold. So he is on a plantation being sold around about the time he's about 8 years old. He is sold from plantation to plantation. He is an unruly kid by all accounts, that he doesn't follow instructions well. He doesn't listen well, all this other stuff. So owners get exasperated with him relatively quickly and they just sell him off to somebody else. He is kind of viewed as damaged goods as far as a slave goes. Not surprisingly, you're born as a slave and they take you from your mother. You want to be grumpy? You're going to be grumpy. All right. So what ends up happening is he transfers over to another owner, all right, and he sees just the horrificnesses of slavery as he's about 10 years old, all right. He just sees the absolute horrors of slavery working on these farms and specifically cotton farms. It is stereotypical awful. And he sees it. He's horrified by it. He sees the beatings that take place. That is common in Hollywood. Hollywood never skips over the beatings because beatings absolutely took place. But he sees how, like, his life doesn't matter. He sees all this other stuff. All right. Now, Frederick Douglass is also naturally very intelligent. That's just a thing. All right. So he's not a very good worker because he's kind of has a rebellious nature from the beginning. From a child, he's rebellious. He doesn't want to work. So eventually, he bounces around from farm to farm, and they get tired of him, and they're going to move him to, they're going to sell him to a couple, all right? So he sells him to an affluent couple in Baltimore, all right, which still is in Maryland. So here's a situation that happens with him in Maryland. So he is purchased by I believe it's a doctor and his wife. They have never owned a slave before. So the other plantations he was at had a bunch of other slaves. These people had never owned a slave before, so they buy Frederick Douglas because they wanted a house slave, somebody to like help around the house. All right. Well, now first off, Frederick Douglass was like bred, and we'll talk about how awful that concept is, but it is exactly what happened, to work in the fields, and now they want him to work in the house. It's just weird for everybody involved, other than the fact that it's slavery and you're owning a human. But so when he shows up at these people's houses, the owner's wife is a retired school teacher. She immediately sees how smart that Frederick Douglass is, and her natural instinct as a retired school teacher is to teach him how to read. All right, so she starts teaching Frederick Douglass how to read. Now, the owner comes home and is like, hey, you can't teach him how to read. That's like against the law. You can't teach a slave how to read. And she's like, oh, my bad. I didn't realize that was against the rules. So the wife no longer teaches him how to read. However, he picked it up quick enough that he has now learned how to read. He starts reading everything he can get his hands on in this fancy townhouse here in Baltimore. There's all types of books and stuff, and he reads about it. And Frederick Douglass, as he grows up to be a teenager, is adamantly against slavery, adamantly against it. Now, it should be interesting to point out that the owners here don't treat him bad. He never, and he gets passed around here, but it's just within the same family. So he has a couple different locations here in Baltimore, but he's in the same family. He has his own bedroom. He has new clothes. He has really anything that you would need as a child. They didn't have kids, so they treated him like their own child, more or less. All right. He had it pretty good. And that's important to point out because he's going to reference that later in life. All right. So when I say he's good, he's still a slave. And that's the important part here. But they treated him fine. That it was, as far as being a slave was concerned, he had about as good of a setup as a slave can have, which is setting the bar low, but that is the situation for Frederick Douglass. Then he reaches about 17 years old. Frederick Douglass is a large human being. All right, he ends up being very large. One day, I imagine it's something like the owner is like, "All right, Frederick, I want you to take out the trash," and Frederick's like, "No," and the owner's like, "Yeah, take out trash," and Frederick Douglass is like, "No," and like runs up to his room and like slams the door. Being a defiant 17-year-old. Well, you can't have a slave be defiant. So what he does, all right, is they're going to ship Frederick Douglass off to somewhere that is, to a guy that's called a slave breaker, all right? So what a slave breaker does is breaks a slave. It's like the dog whisperer, but for slaves. You send defiant slaves off to the slave breaker, and the slave breaker is going to send them back perfectly docile and agreeable with everything else. So they send them off to the slave breaker. Welp. Does it? All right, so what happens is the first day he's at the slave breaker, he's all out in the middle of the country. Frederick Douglass comes outside, and the slave breaker comes up to him and says, "Frederick, you're going to dig a hole right here." And Frederick's like, "No, I'm not." And then the slave breaker beats him up really bad. All right. And as Frederick Douglass is laying in a heap on the ground, the slave breaker's like, "We'll try this again tomorrow." So the next day he comes out, and Frederick Douglass comes out, and he's like, "Dig a hole." And Frederick Douglass is like, "I told you I wasn't going to." The slave breaker beats him again and leaves him in a hump on the ground and walks away. The third day, the slave breaker goes out there and tells Frederick Douglass, "I want you to dig a hole." And Frederick Douglass says, "Not only am I not going to dig a hole, you ain't going to hit me again." And the slave breaker says, "Oh yeah," and turns around to hit him. And Frederick Douglass beats him to death with his own hands. Now, let me clarify this historically. Almost all the videos and stuff I see now is just that Frederick Douglass beat him up. I was originally taught in college that he killed the man, but looking at the story, I think maybe I was taught wrong. I think it is more likely that he did just really beat the guy up really bad and didn't kill him, but we'll go with he beat him up really bad. So Frederick Douglass beats this guy up, all right, and like the guy runs away. Well, once Frederick Douglass has beat this guy up, this is a slave that just beat up a white guy who's like the slave breaker. Like that is, you'll probably be executed for that. I mean, it is that severe of a crime. So Frederick Douglass has to escape, all right? Now, Maryland is right next to the North. Frederick Douglass is smart enough to know, because he's educated himself now, that if he gets to the North, that he can be free. So Frederick Douglass is going to escape to the North in the most ridiculous possible way possible, all right? If this is a movie, this is the time of the movie where I say this is fake, all right? But this is really what happens. Frederick Douglass sneaks to the North, not on foot, not in a wagon, by pretending to be a sailor in the United States Navy and hopping on a ship and sailing north. Now, the reason I say, to me, in my mind, it seems really weird, black people weren't allowed in the Navy. Frederick Douglass is not a light-skinned slave. There is no passing for a white guy for him. So how in the world he passed? First off, and he's enormous. Usually people in the Navy are relatively small at the time because you had to pack on the ships. He's an enormous black human being like that just pretend like, yep, I'm the new sailor, guys. I imagine the uniform doesn't fit, like the buttons are like stretching across his chest. He's like, I've just got a tan, just mopping the deck. And then all the other sailors must have been like, okay, that seems normal. Whatever it is, this is an actual true event that he actually sneaks to the North, pretending to be a sailor on the United States Navy, gets to the North, and then when he gets out in the North, he's like, wow, this is absolutely crazy that he is free. Now, he does marry a woman named Anna Murray, who is a free woman he had met in Baltimore who traveled north when he escaped, and they get married in the North. So he is now a free man in the North, all right? Obviously, you know, if he's captured, he'll go back to being a slave. So let me bring myself back over here, and let me show you a picture of Frederick Douglass. So this is an actual photograph of Frederick Douglass. Now, Frederick Douglass was not the first or the last person to escape slavery, all right, and run north. Far from it. But there is something very unique about Frederick Douglass. He's an escaped slave who can read and write. That is huge, because there is no TV, there's no internet, the only way you could communicate with large groups of people is through writing, right? Through newspapers and stuff like that. So Frederick Douglass has that ability. So Frederick Douglass realizes that there is an abolitionist movement in the North, right? He was somewhat familiar with it. He's actually going to link up with William Lloyd Garrison, who is the leader of the Liberator, or the editor of the Liberator eventually. Frederick Douglass is going to write a book. This is the big mamma jamma. It's called The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. It's his life story, all right? Here is why, and this is a picture of the book, Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, all right? Book is a game changer, because here's what Frederick Douglass says in the book. He says, hey, tell you guys what, I was a slave. Here's my story. Unlike Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, these are true events. So he talks about being taken from his mom. He talks about the beatings that he witnessed. He tells the exact story of him, how he was treated in Baltimore by his owners. And I think this can't be stated enough. He said, I was treated good. My owners, I think they genuinely cared about me. I think they loved me. I think treated me like a son. They actually, as far as being a slave goes, I had it better probably than any other slave. But you know what? It was the most miserable experience of my life because I didn't matter. I didn't exist. I think it's pivotal with what he is saying there for the mindsets of the North. It's not about the physical abuse, because there's farmers everywhere that have to deal with grueling physical abuse by trade. If you've ever met a brick mason before, that is brutal work, right? It's not about the work. It's not like, oh, it's so hard for them, picking cotton all day. Most of the people in the South, white people in the South, did it to survive from day to day, and they chose to do it. That's not the evils of slavery. The evils of slavery is the fact that you don't matter and you don't exist. All right. And he was like, even though I was treated well and I had everything I needed, I knew my existence didn't matter. So Frederick Douglas writes about that in his book called The Life and Times of Frederick Douglas. So much so that he actually names who his owners are. He's like, here's the people that own me. They still exist. They live down there. But if you don't believe me, go knock on their door. They exist. That's crazy risky. Not only that, he's like, hey, and any of you guys that would like to donate to me or whatever, here's where I live at now in the North. And like gives his address. So here's his owners who he's like named so they know exactly who this is. Then he also put his address in the book. This becomes a huge bestseller. All right. Everybody sees it and they see the new horrors, the true horrors of slavery. Now, this is huge. They're going to come get him. Like, he's still technically, by the laws of the South, he's still a slave. So he is no longer safe here. And he initially wanted to stay in the North and because he has a lot of supporters. He got really famous. They convince him to move to England, which is what he does. He goes to England. He constantly writes, and a lot of his writings get published in William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator magazine, which is an anti-slavery magazine, for the rest of his life. They were going to send bounty hunters out after him and all this other stuff. Because the South hated him with a passion, all right, because of everything he stood for. He called out slavery, all right. So, a little side note, eventually he had enough supporters in England, and he ended up being a relatively wealthy guy for the time period. He could have bought his own freedom, but he's like, I refuse to do that. Absolutely not. So what ends up happening is all of his supporters in England, they ended up getting enough money together themselves and bought his freedom from his owners and then gave him his papers. This way he could travel back to America and legally he could travel back and forth and not be taken back into slavery, even though it would be extremely dangerous with the hatred that he experiences from the South from his book, The Life and Times of Frederick Douglas. But Frederick Douglas is a pivotal part of the abolitionist movement because he shows the North the true nature of slavery. Like, it's not sugar-coated, it's not pretend. This is exactly what slavery is like. And even if you're treated good, the absolute worst part of it is the fact that you are you have no value. You don't exist, really. Like, your existence doesn't mean anything on earth because once you die, you're gone. And as a slave, they take your humanity from you in that respect. All right. So tensions are rising here in the United States. So the big time that you have to remember is 1860. Right? The election of 1860 and then 1861, but 1860, that's when the Civil War is going to start. So throughout this unit, as we are moving up through this time period, understand that as we get closer to 1860, tensions are going to do nothing but rise. All right, as you're inching up closer to 1860. Because 1860 is when everything blows up and everybody starts murdering each other. Beginning of 1861. All right, so the tensions between the North and the South is like palpable at this point. So much tension and so much argument is taking place in the government that they can't actually do their job. So what they do is they pass a law called the gag rule. All right, because all everybody wants to do is argue over slavery, so they can't do the typical budget. They can't do the normal stuff the government needs to do because everyone wants to argue over slavery. So the government passes the gag rule, which says you are not allowed to talk about slavery for 8 years. If you can't talk about it, you can't do anything about it. So they said you can't talk about slavery for 8 years. So if you can't talk about it, you can't change it. This is crazy. So for 8 years, if you can't talk about slavery, you can't change it. This is a huge win, really, for the South, because with no changes, everything keeps going the same way. One of the big creators of this, here I should mention this, is John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams is no longer the president, son of John Adams. He's back in Congress, and he is the big push behind this whole gag rule. Just like, let's just not talk about it. It'll go away. The gag rule is important in history to realize if there's a really, really big problem, just ignoring it does not make it go away. And the gag rule is a perfect example of that. They couldn't talk about it for 8 years, hoping magically it'll go away. Ignoring a problem does not make it go away. All right. So, changing gears here, the Underground Railroad. So it is important to talk about the Underground Railroad because it's amazing and it's awesome that the human desire to be free leads to things like the Underground Railroad. Let me clarify, because I'm not even going to tell you how old I was before I figured this out and felt really, really embarrassed. So I just want to say it. There is no train involved in the Underground Railroad. No train. There's not. Not at all. Nope. There's no subway system. And again, I'm not going to tell you how old I was before I realized that. All right. So you always hear Underground Railroad, and probably mentally you're thinking of a railroad, like a train. Oh, cool. There's like secret trains. No, it's not a secret train at all. There's no trains involved. The Underground Railroad is not consistent. Let me tell you what happens. Once the slaves aggressively don't want to be slaves anymore, Second Great Awakening helped lead to that. They start realizing that they can make it up here to what in this picture are the blue states, that they can be free. Now, typically when you get up here, all free means is that you're not going to be like forced into slavery, but you're going to experience a lot of racism. So typically when people make it here, they're just getting here in order to make it to Canada. But once you get to the blue states, you can breathe and travel in the daytime, to get to Canada, when Canada treats you a lot better than anywhere in America, even in the free states. Because the North is still incredibly racist. So, the Underground Railroad is actually a term coined, all right, by the Southern plantation owners. All right. Once the slaves realized that if they get to the North, they can make it, and they started figuring out there's different ways, depending on where you were, of making it to the North. All right. And how to secretly do it. They would just leave in the middle of the night and they would be gone. So the owners would wake up and their slaves are gone. Millions of dollars worth of labor just gone. All right. This is like the plantation owner's biggest fear, that this would happen. Terrified that this would happen. All right. And so the slaves are just gone and you don't know where they went. And so the plantation owners are like, it's almost like they just got on like a railroad and disappeared, but it's like a secret railroad, like an underground railroad, and just poof, vanished and never to be seen from again. So that's where the term Underground Railroad came from, is just the owners just didn't know where they went, and they came up with that analogy that it was like they just poof, they're gone, never to be seen again. I should also point out, while the Underground Railroad is crazy famous, not a lot of people took advantage of it. You're literally putting your life on the line. All right. You still probably, unless your whole family goes, you still have family back at the plantation and they might be punished because you're leaving. So it is amazing when you see these slaves make it to the North in the Underground Railroad and the risk that they took to get there. The North is going to take their stories and put them in newspapers all over the place. So that is why it is so famous. There were thousands. There were millions and millions and millions of slaves. There's thousands, all right? Probably less than 10,000 people actually escaped on the Underground Railroad. But just the fact that the Underground Railroad exists, all right, a series of networks to get to the North is one of the more impressive things. So there's three main ways of getting from the South to the North, all right? If you're on the East Coast, if you could get on a boat, this looks like it's getting on a boat and making it north. Hooray. I don't know how that's really going to happen unless you commandeer a boat and sneak north. That could happen, but I don't know how common that is. If you can sneak through the swamps, this was common. Dogs would come out and get the scent and track you, but in the swamps, it's very hard to track people through the swamps in the eastern part of like North Carolina and South Carolina and Virginia. However, there's a lot of like poisonous animals and gators and crocodiles, alligators. Which one do we got? Oh, I'm going to look dumb right now because I can't tell. Just pretend like I said the right one, because I don't know which one it is. Because I don't know the difference of them. The one with the narrow mouth. That's the one we got, but... Right? I'm showing my ignorance. Anywho, if they make it all the way to the north, here they can make it. However, the problem here is that it's very dangerous. A lot of people will get hurt and die on that route. The quickest way was the Mississippi River. If you can stow away on the Mississippi River, you can make it up there in about a day or so on a steamboat. However, this is also the easiest way to get caught trying to make it up north. So the highest success rate is actually here. And this is a little to the right of where it should be, is the Appalachian Mountains. That if the slaves can make it to the Appalachian Mountains, which run all the way up in this region, if they can get to the Appalachian Mountains, they usually are pretty good because horses and dogs do not try. I mean, the dogs can, but you have to have a man on horseback, like a slave catcher. Usually are not going to be able to make it through the Appalachian Trail, and slaves are usually in pretty good shape from their brutal life they've been forced to live, that they can make it down the Appalachian Trail, which will come out here in the north, and once they're in the north, they'll go to Canada. There were other, you can see these here, like Texas, they go down into Mexico because Mexico had outlawed slavery. Florida, I'm guessing this is going down into Cuba, which may have allowed, but again, you still have to get in a boat somehow here. But all these different routes to get to the north were collectively referred to as the Underground Railroad. The most famous person with the Underground Railroad, and rightfully so, is Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman's biographer did her a massive injustice when she wrote her biography of her, because her biographer drastically exaggerated how many people Harriet Tubman got to safety. Her biographer was like thousands of people she brought. It was more like 85, I believe, people that she saved from slavery. The fact that her biographer exaggerated, and then we found out later that that was fake, it hurts Harriet Tubman's image. And Harriet Tubman never tried to get in the limelight at all right? But once she figured out her route in the Underground Railroad, she would come back and she would get other people. She famously would carry a gun with her, and she would carry the gun she would have absolutely shot somebody that was trying to arrest them. But the gun was, the only time she ever had to pull it out was a couple of times on the people that she was saving. They'd get like a day away and be like, I don't know, I want to go back. I'm scared. I think I should return. And she'd pull the gun on them and be like, if you go back, you're going to tell them where we are and you put everybody in danger. I want to have to shoot you before I let you go back. Harriet Tubman was not here for fun and games and to hug it out. Harriet Tubman was here to do a job, and that was to get people to the north. So Harriet Tubman, super famous part of the Underground Railroad, and rightfully very famous. Fun story, she was also a spy for the Union in the Civil War. So during the Civil War, she was a spy, was a military spy. Fantastic, awesome stories with Harriet Tubman. All right, technology. All right. So, and this is important when we get to the Civil War to understand this. So, railroads sped up everything. All right, let's see what we got here. So, these are the railroad tracks. All right, now notice how just like right here, this is Chicago. All right, this is like the hub of everything. So, anything that comes and goes in this whole region goes through Chicago. All right. They're just packed in here all over the place. So the ability to travel and to move stuff is much easier to be done in the north than it is here in the south. Because the south only really needs a few railroad lines just to move their cotton north. That's about the only thing the south needs it for. The north needs all these railroad lines to move it from factory to factory and all that. The reason that is important is when the Civil War starts, you use railroads to move troops around. Well, who has the most railroads? The North. And due to that, they are able to quickly move their stuff from one side to another, their troops from one side to another, very quickly and very smoothly. And then there is a guy named Sam Morse. All right. This is little Sam Morse right here. He creates Morse code. This is the thing where it's like beep, 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 communication. All right. So Sam Morse creates the Morse code because you create something cool, name it after yourself. Sam Morse knows to do this. So here's he is with his sweet beard and massive medals. Here's why Morse code is going to be extremely influential in the Civil War. So Morse code line, they run basically like in power lines, but they have to be in a long straight line because if it has a whole bunch of twists and turns in the line, the signal doesn't make it and it just disappears. So when they decided to put up telegraph lines, they had to find long straight areas. Well, they'd already cut out long straight areas where railroad tracks were at. All right. All these places here had already been cleared out. So telegraph lines just get run over the top of railroad tracks. It also is beneficial in case like a telegraph line breaks, you can get out there to it on a railroad and fix it. So wherever there's a railroad track, you have telegraph lines, right? So there's all this communication. The reason that's important is when the Civil War starts, who has better communication, the North or the South? The North will, because they have more railroad tracks to run telegraph lines at. The South limited on their communication because they have limited railroad lines. So, but the speed, the creation of the telegraph, the beep, 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 by this dude is going to be pivotal for communication during the Civil War. All right. That's as far as we're going to get today. The stories just keep progressively getting cooler. So that's as far as we're going to get today. I will see you guys tomorrow.